start, but here we go. Let's hope it gets a little bit better from here. So yeah, just to thank Hannah, my name is Declan Tobin and I am one of the marine species team leaders in JNCC. And we were very kindly invited to talk to you today about, I guess, the marine conservation landscape and particularly how it relates to marine species. And this is a rather large area of work, and it reflects the input from across the full range within the marine species team. There are about 16 people within the team. Most of them are marine ornithology specialists, but we also have a component of marine mammal specialists and a small amount of support for marine fish and turtles. And the content here is very much derived from the work that they have done over the last number of years. So I should start the presentation by thanking them all hugely for the input that they've provided over the last couple of weeks. So I wanted to start by giving a bit of a potted history of conservation and ultimately where we are with marine conservation around the UK. It's very hard to establish exactly when conservation, the concept of conservation, came into our thinking. There's a body that suggests that it really began in the early 19th century with the likes of the Romantic authors that started to romanticize about the world around them and create this sense of value in nature beyond just intrinsic pounds, shillings and pence. And the focus on that really was more around those iconic species and those species of particular value, which led to things like the Wild Birds Protection Act in the 1870s, which really was the first piece of legislation to tackle that idea, or that concept of protection, environmental protection. And that followed shortly after the founding of the RSPB, which obviously is still with us well over 140 years later. And while other parts of the world, there was a greater movement away from just simply thinking more about species to the concept of environmental or space protection. And in the US, the national parks movement was building towards the tail end of the 19th century. It was really in the middle of the 20th century in the UK that we first started to legislate for national parks and the concept of management of environmental space, and also established the Nature Conservancy, which was the first body really to look at management of research primarily into the environment and impacts of human activities in the environment. And it wasn't until 1951 that the first national park was established in the UK in the Lakes District. And indeed, it wasn't until 2002 that the first national park was established in Scotland, albeit that there were a number of other designation types over the years. But it goes to show that it's a relatively recent concept. And actually what we perceive as environmental management now probably really came about from what's loosely termed the modern environmental movement, but that was a range of different things and a changing in attitudes really to how we manage the environment. Based on things like Rachel Carson's seminal book in the 1960s, The Silent Spring, that charted the impact of DDT in the US on the environment, but also closer to home, what was at the time the world's largest oil spill disaster off the coast of Cornwall, the Torrey Canyon oil spill disaster. That really changed minds and attitudes in terms of how we manage the environment. And around that time, proliferation, or it started to see a proliferation of different bodies that were interested in both the study of and conservation of marine space. So the Natural Environment Research Council was established in 1965, and that took the Nature Conservancy on board. And then in the 1970s, the professionalization of conservation, so the establishment of bodies designed to deliver conservation as a policy priority, first appeared in the guise of the Nature Conservancy Council. And they followed at a time when globally, much greater interest in tackling nature conservation as a global issue, global problem, and probably the two most seminal conventions global conventions, the Berne and the Bonn Convention in 1979, started to address issues of biodiversity and also of species conservation. And that also tied in with the EU Birds Directive, which was also passed at the same time, or agreed in 1979. And then within the UK, implementing legislation that allowed government to actively start to manage and to meet a lot of these new commitments through the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and then dealing with pollution in 1990 from the Environment Protection Act. And I guess we're all familiar with the various environment protection bodies that now exist across the land. And that was very much focused on the impact of human activities, again, on the environment. And then in the early 1990s, bodies like ourselves, JNCC, that had come out of things like the Nature Conservancy Council, the statutory nature conservation bodies were created in the guise that you're probably familiar with them now. So the likes of SNH, and I guess there might be several on the call now or on the webinar now, but SNH, what was English Nature, now Natural England, same Countryside Council for Wales, which is now NRW, first appeared on the scene. And while the EU Birds Directive was in place from 1979, that was obviously focused predominantly on birds and the areas of importance, conservation importance for birds. But the EU Habitats Directive starts to fill the gap in terms of the focus on a wider range of species beyond birds, but also on spaces and habitats of critical importance from an EU perspective. So that really covers the environmental, the change in terms of environmental policy and environmental law, but actually the focus on marine conservation really started to shift in the 2000s, because we started to see, despite the fact that things like the EU, the Habitats Directive and the Birds Directive were included elements of the marine, in 2007, the offshore conservation regs enabled in law to deliver on those commitments, and then followed through with things like the EU Strategy Framework Directive in 2008, which linked back to what was at the time in '92 the first marine convention concerned with the protection of the marine environment in the Northeast Atlantic. And the Marine Strategy Framework Directive in 2008 provided the EU with the mechanism for delivering on commitments under things like the OSPAR Convention, and to ensure sustainable development in the marine environment. And that then was finally followed by the legislation, Marine Access and the Marine and Coastal Access Act and the Marine Scotland Act in the tail end of the 2000s. So that really is a fly through to where we are in terms of the rules and regulations. What is it that we do as JNCC? Well, we're a public body, and we provide the advice. We straddle that marine policy evidence space, and we provide scientific advice into government primarily, and we work into government, but we work in collaboration. So most of what I talk about throughout the course of this presentation, it's very much about collaborative effort, and we work closely with obviously the other agencies, but also with various environmental NGOs, industry, as well as academic institutes. And we also have a role in the international area, particularly with overseas territories. There are about 180 of us in total in JNCC, and it's a mix predominantly of scientific and technical staff. We're split primarily across Peterborough and Aberdeen, majority down in Peterborough, although there are about 40 to 50 of us in Aberdeen, of which the marine species team, the vast bulk of them are based in Aberdeen, including myself. And then we have a small number of individuals that are posted either within agencies or within government, and we have one member of staff down in the Falklands. I'll refer to them in a while. So the types of things that we do, as I mentioned, we're that sort of interface between policy and science. Most of the staff have some form of environmental science training background, and the technical expertise that we have tends to be in ecological or in data analytical type fields. We traditionally work across boundaries because the countryside agencies largely deal with the inshore environment for the marine species the UK component, most of what we do within JNCC tends to be in the offshore beyond that 12 nautical mile area, and we work very closely across the devolved administrations with central government and also with the EU and beyond, certainly have traditionally. And as I said from the outset, it's all very much about working in partnership. It's a shared space, it's a big space. Why do we do what we do? Well, there are a lot of acronyms here, and those acronyms will repeat, although I don't propose to explain them all right now. They will crop up and I'll give a bit more of a detailed explanation. But ostensibly, over the years, we've accumulated a lot of commitments to various things, and particularly in relation to conservation within of marine species within the marine environment. And we have an obligation as a state to meet those commitments, and our role is to help support government to meet those commitments. So to start really at what those commitments are, start looking at them in a bit more detail and how we manage the marine and why. The Convention on Biological Diversity is probably familiar to most of you. It was one of the first and most overarching agreements, global agreements on delivering protection, both terrestrially and in the marine environment. It covers all ecosystems and species and is very much focused on sustainable development within the natural environment. The series of 20 targets that were established, the reporting in 20. I found this on the web. Reporting in 2020, my phone has suddenly decided to answer a question for me. 20 targets that we're due to report to in 2020 this year. We'll actually be moving beyond that. So there was a plan for this year at the Conference of Parties for CBD to start looking at the next phase through to 2050. But that's obviously been put on hold till next year. But these Aichi targets, the area that we're probably most familiar with in JNCC in terms of reporting are around targets 11 and 12, which are the protected areas and the species components. But as you can see, it's a pretty broad ranging convention. The other main convention, the Bonn Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species. This, unsurprisingly, of the 4 agreements to which the UK is party, 3 of them have a marine component. And again, given the migratory nature, that's probably not a major surprise. And we're involved in helping support government in meeting their obligations on this, or at least providing the advice. And they are conservation of water birds, migratory water birds, including seabirds, conservation of small cetaceans in the Northeast Atlantic area and the Baltic, and then the agreement on conservation of albatrosses and petrels, which probably isn't something that most of you are familiar with in this part of the world, but in our capacity as providing advice to overseas territories, we have a member of staff who's based down in the Falklands who specifically helps with the implementation and the delivery on commitments under that agreement. Outside of those agreements, those legally binding agreements, there are also a number of memoranda of understanding, and there's one for turtles in the Indian Ocean, which again is linked more directly through to the responsibilities of the overseas territories, and also the conservation of migratory sharks. Outside of the 2 biggie conventions, there are also a range of other commitments, and I mentioned Ramsar Convention here, which predates the 2, the Bern and Bonn conventions, but this particular convention, albeit that it's a wetlands, it's a protection of wetlands, those wetlands in themselves, there's a strong marine component there, given how important many of those wetlands are for breeding seabirds. So we have a role in reporting against commitments under Ramsar. And then the UK was one of the early signatories to the International Whaling Commission, although we don't do as much work now into that, but as you're probably all familiar, that's focused on the conservation of whales and their management. So those high-level framework agreements, it's almost a pyramidal structure where you tend to find that you have the global agreements, and then underneath that you'll have a set of rules and regulations that stem or flow out of either regional rules in the case of EU directives right down into domestic law, and they're all interconnected and the law will often point to different elements in different international agreements. So from a regional point of view, the EU nature directives were the regulatory framework to help member states meet their obligations under these large global agreements. And they included things like the Birds Directive, which would have focused on things like Ramsar, but also things like CBD, and the Habitats Directive. Now, the Birds Directive was, as it says, you might imagine, was designed to protect European wild birds, including seabirds, but it's focused on the birds and the habitats that they are associated with, that they rely on, and the establishment of the first in a series of the marine protected areas that we're going to refer to throughout this talk, but special protected areas. There are a range of different names and terms for marine protected areas, and for birds, special protected areas in the classification type. For the Habitats Directive, much more focused on the other species and those habitats of particular conservation importance. And the MPA of choice in the Habitats Directive are the special areas of conservation. And again, some of you may well be familiar with those, and there are many marine examples of special areas of conservation. And I'll take you through some of the marine species one in a while. Sitting underneath those directives is a plethora of primary legislation: Wildlife Countryside Act, Marine Coastal Access Act, Marine Act, all supporting the delivery of commitments to these directives. And there's a range of secondary legislation that sits under these again that I'm going to go into right now. So that's very much the focus around for species habitat protection. But in terms of the wider marine environment, in trying to bring together a more coherent strategy for protection of the marine environment, the OSPAR Convention, which came out of two separate agreements, the Oslo and Paris agreements. The OSPAR Convention from '92 brought 15 states together in the Northeast Atlantic region. And most of those states are EU states, but the EU was also a signatory in its own right. And the concept was to cooperate in a strategic plan to manage the Northeast Atlantic environment. It focused more on quality condition reporting, and that sort of set the theme for what's come out of other instruments subsequent to that. And this concept of clean, healthy, biological, diverse ecosystems, that starts to pervade through the policy space from here on in. And it also starts to bring together the idea of an ecologically coherent network rather than MPAs for specific habitats and species. It's targeted at trying to bring those MPAs together in a coherent strategy to help deliver on a more holistic management plan across the Northeast Atlantic area. And leading this through to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which again enables EU member states or provides the framework with which to meet obligations under what is a non-legally binding convention. OSPAR isn't legally binding. MSFD, by contrast, requires member states, of which we were at the time signing in 2008. The emphasis there is very much on sustainable development. And you'll see that again links through to things like CBD. It is about sustainable development of the marine environment or the marine space. And the concept of good environmental status appears. And again, that's linked through to quality status, similar concepts, and defined based on 11 descriptors. So specific things that we use to define what environmental status is and the condition of that status. There are also, unsurprisingly, a range of different legislative tools that are in place that manage the activities of in the marine space. And they range from management at the project level, so specific elements of industry operation that are licensed, right through to coherent planning, so planning for big developments. The Environmental Impact Assessment Directive and Strategic Environmental Assessment Directive, they're not exclusively marine, but they do pertain to the marine. And marine industries, particularly things like renewables, oil and gas, aggregates, those sorts of things, particularly where they're a large strategic plan, the concept is that you projects consider environmental impact, but also at the planning phase, you need to consider what those impacts would be. And the idea is that these help support policy, but they don't drive the policy. So government policy is still independent, but decision-making and the framework for decision-making requires consideration of environmental impacts. So on to the sort of future-looking policy. Most of what I've been talking about is retrospective, looking backwards. And going back to the clean, healthy, safe, productive, biologically diverse, which is the sort of tagline for management of the marine space going forward. We have things like the 25-year environment plan from DEFRA, which was published in 2018, and that uses the same sort of terminology, so good environmental status, sustainable development, well-managed MPA, so commitments to those into the future and carrying that through. And similarly in Scotland, the 2020 Challenge for Scotland's biodiversity references MPAs, improved monitoring, and also brings in those priority features, habitats and species that are of critical importance to Scotland. And there isn't to the same extent the policies with Wales and Northern Ireland developed in the same way, although there are a number of elements of law that exist that emphasize the importance and requirement to protect the marine space in those devolved regions. So that's a kind of a fly through of the rules and how it works and why we do what we do. In terms of the role that we have as JNCC and the work that we do, broadly speaking, divided into three main categories. We're involved in the data end, so both in terms of data collection, data coordination, data management, and analytics. And that links into, that data is often used for monitoring, so responsibility for monitoring and coordination of monitoring programs. And that in turn feeds into reporting, so reporting to meet all of those obligations and the various things I've already referenced earlier on in the talk. And then the other side is probably the more routine in terms of the management, ongoing management of activities that are happening in the marine space, both in terms of the impacts and also provision of advice around mitigation of those impacts of ongoing industries. So if I start with the reporting, and this by no means is an exhaustive list, but it gives you a rough idea that in terms of reporting into, be it conventions of various regulations, there are a range of different drivers against which we and then the marine species team report or support government in reporting, I should say. And they all tend to have their own specific reporting cycles. And as you can see on the right-hand column with reporting years, it's typical that in any given year that you may have 2 or 3 different reporting regimes that you are involved in. I'd say broadly speaking, it divides the reporting into 3 categories. The condition type reporting, which could be species or wider environment condition reporting, activities and pressures, so understanding about what's happening in the environment and what those pressures are from human activities. And then there's the reporting on the implementation of convention, so how are we doing, which is often a synthesis of some of the other reporting, but again, a slightly different format, but it tends to deliver into those broad global conventions. In terms of the science then, the reporting, particularly for the status and the activities and pressures, for status, the types of reporting that we do in the marine space tend to be things like reporting on species distribution, size, population trends, and fortunately with seabirds, and I'll talk you through that briefly in a minute, but we have much better data sets where we can get into the nitty-gritty of things like survival and breeding success and that type of thing. And that information, and I provided some indications of the types of schematic, but these schematics with the wee beasties on them come from the UK Marine Strategy status assessments, which were done in 2018. Now, those strategy assessments are part of our meeting our obligations to the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. So every country develops its own strategy. And we tend to do it in 3 phases, where we'll have phase 1 or part 1, where we do the status assessment. Part 2, we look at the monitoring plans. and then part 3, the measures that are currently in place to deliver. We're actually currently in 2020, we're moving towards the part 3 phase of that assessment process. But this is an example of the type of how we use the status data in high-level summaries of condition. So where we are in relation to good environmental status and what has changed since the last report. And then in terms of activities and pressures, it's typically reporting on things like bycatch, pollution events, or disturbance. So clearly the reporting is very dependent on the monitoring, and again, using the clean, healthy, safe, productive, and biologically diverse handle, the UK Marine Monitoring Assessment Strategy looks to deliver on that commitment across government and across all of the devolved administrations. And JNCC are involved in coordinating the Marine Biodiversity Monitoring Programme. This programme, critically speaking, despite the fact that we'll be coordinating, it only works because it's a collaborative effort across a plethora of different agencies, and it involves working across the entire monitoring community, each of which will have their own responsibilities and lead on specific areas. Coordinating on the strategy primarily to meet the needs of the various legislative and international convention drivers or policy drivers, commitments that governments have, and trying to integrate monitoring to make sure that it's delivered, I guess, effectively and in the most cost-efficient way. And there are a range of different monitoring programs that exist in the marine environment. From the marine species point of view, seabirds, cetaceans, seals, fish, cephalopods, but there's also the monitoring program, seabed habitats, MPAs, and the pelagic area. In JNCC's perspective, we are involved in the seabird, cetaceans, habitats, and MPAs, and unsurprisingly for the marine species team, it's the seabirds and cetaceans element of this work that we're most directly involved with. But all of these work in collaboration with one another, or indeed should do. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what that looks like, probably the largest of, or the most comprehensive program that we're directly involved with is the Seabird Monitoring Program, and it's one that we coordinate, but it's been in existence since 1986, but it involves a partnership of 19 organizations. So you can see the sheer number of bodies that are involved in delivering this. It definitely isn't a one organization program by any manner of means. The program itself reports annually, reports on routine population changes and trends, and it also helps in determining what the potential causes of changes might be, given the extent of reporting and the detail in which we're reporting. And I don't think there are very many monitoring programs that have that level of detail, which is absolutely fantastic. And last year's one was published only a matter of weeks ago. I go the wrong way. Okay. So moving then into the data collection. So what underpins a lot of these monitoring programs, we're also involved both in terms of steering a lot of the data collection programs and coordinating, but also to some extent, particularly the seabirds, in the active collection of data. And for marine mammals, the main data collection programs that exist are again, some of you may well be familiar with some of these, and I apologize for the acronyms, but the stranding schemes, so CSIP and SMAS, they're collecting information from members of the public reporting strandings into a centralized system, and JNCC sit on the steering group for a lot of these programs. Same with the bycatch monitoring program, which JNCC sit on the steering group. And then there's it's decadal, more or less, survey of cetaceans in the Atlantic. So it's an at-sea survey, the SCAN survey, and that survey is used to underpin a lot of the advice we have on things like distribution, presence, absence, and seasonality of cetaceans in the marine environment. As you might imagine, it's a lot more difficult to survey cetaceans than it is seabirds in terms of accessibility. And the Joint Cetacean Database Program, which I'm not going to make reference to now, but I'll touch on in a minute. For seabirds, much more comprehensive programs, tend to be more long-standing. Two main bodies of work: the breeding seabird, the census of breeding seabirds, and also seabirds at sea. The seabird census, this work is very much linked to the seabird monitoring program, albeit that the census itself isn't annual. So the census is a whole site. It's not a sub-sample of sites. It's, as it says on the tin, it's a full census of all seabirds in Britain and Ireland. There have been 4 of them, and we're in the middle of the 4th one right now. It was due to deliver this year, but unfortunately, that is unlikely to happen now until next year. The idea of doing a complete seabird census really is to help test the accuracy of the annual seabird monitoring program and to understand those trends, and also to understand how breeding seabird populations change spatially. So that might be particularly relevant for, say, sitting in Aberdeen, listening to them outside my window right now. Things like herring gulls are urban nesting birds or inland nesting birds, and how they change their habitat or habits and behavior, and what that might mean in terms of numbers and assessing trends. And also a full seabird census helps better interpretation of why changes may be occurring. But it's not an insignificant undertaking, because you're looking at 10,000 sites for those 25 species that are included in the monitoring program. So it's a colossal task. It's something that the partners, the breeding program, are routinely involved in, and the most recent census began in 2015, and between the partners, the majority of the colonies were censused by 2019. However, even though a lot of those are the largest colonies, they don't necessarily represent the largest number of colonies. And one of the elements of work that we've been involved with, and we have a dedicated project officer, Daisy's been hard at work trying to raise the profile, so starting to bring citizen science into this, starting to canvass and look for volunteers to help input the seabird count, because these things are just unsustainable if they're centrally funded. So she's done a huge amount of work in terms of promoting the census and trying to get volunteers on board, and she's been remarkably successful in doing so, and she's managed to get upwards of 1,000 volunteers involved in the process of sampling across, as you can see in the map on the left hand side there, the vast majority of the UK, which is quite incredible. And all going well, despite the issues with this year, it should hopefully deliver by next year at the latest, which will be fantastic. That's just the breeding element of it. So for the non-breeding, it obviously gets much more difficult, harder to get volunteers on board to do the European seabirds at sea. But it is it's a partnership program that involves a range of other European countries, and that data is held in a database that we manage here in JNCC, and we also provide training for others in terms of how to use it, but also in terms of the surveying methodology. It's one of the largest databases of seabird observations in the world, which is pretty incredible, something I guess we're quite proud to have, and remarkably useful in terms of decision making. Not that I would expect anybody to delve into this plot at all, but it just gives you a very broad indication of the scale of the ESAS database, and also the sheer volume of data points that exist across that. So it's a fantastic resource to have. And the reason we'd be interested in something like this, say above and beyond breeding seabirds, it helps with defining distribution, particularly for foraging and that type of thing, non-breeding activities. And that in turn feeds into a lot of the management decision making around things like oil spill response or emergency response, in siting of wind farms and mitigation and that type of thing. So all of these data sets are critically important to management of the marine space. In terms of marine mammals, it's a little bit more complicated, because as I pointed out earlier, marine mammals are probably a bit more difficult to survey by the nature of how they live. And despite the fact that there are a number of state-sponsored surveys through things like the scans that I mentioned, those decadal at-sea surveys, the majority of surveys that take place are usually small scale. They're often delivered as a result of the licensing process and requirement or license condition for operators. So data can be privately held, and there's no central database for cetacean data, which I have to say surprised me when I first came into this realm. But there is currently a DEFRA-funded program to try and establish such a thing. So operating in conjunction with a lot of the main operators and data providers out there, trying to standardize an approach to collection and storage of that data and establishing a routine methodology. And of course, ultimately to encourage the use of the data. So defining what the terms of use, particularly if it's privately owned data. So that is an ongoing project and something we hope will deliver in the coming years at least. So that would be a fantastic resource to have. So moving to the final element of the work that we do, management. Now, management, you could broadly split into providing advice on impacts, but also on the mitigation of activities that are already occurring. And that's across a range of different industries in the marine environment: renewables, oil and gas, fisheries, aggregates, even the MOD, shipping. So the range of different industries. We also are, and this is something that I'm very much more intimately familiar with, the marine protected areas work. I came into the organization 10 years ago working in marine protected areas, and we're still doing it. That's a big tool in the box in terms of marine management, including for marine species. Offshore industries, the types of impacts that we're talking about in this case and providing advice, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but it tends to be things like mortality related to collision or displacement risk, bycatch, noise, as well as destruction of habitats. And the advice we provide is usually into regulators and into government and the decision makers around management, rather than us being the managers. We're very much in the evidence and advice provision. And a similar function will exist inshore for most of the statutory bodies. So most of the work that we do is in the offshore space. Then I guess looking at, taking a more sort of strategic look at how we provide advice to meet commitments for developing offshore renewables development, where there's an ambition to quadruple the capacity up to 2030. That's a huge amount of development in the offshore environment. So there are the range of different issues that crop up on that, and how to ensure best advice provision around the impact of that sort of scale of development. So we've started to get involved much more in the strategic thinking around development of advice requirements in conjunction with industry. So working very closely with industry on identifying what those issues are in terms of development and licensing. We're doing a lot of work around collision modeling, risk modeling, noise modeling, understanding things like cumulative effects. And all of this ultimately is pointing to better impact assessments going forward over the next number of years. And that's a big area of work within the team right now. And then more traditionally, particularly in this part of the world, me being based in Aberdeen, the oil and gas sector, we've provided and we continue to provide that casework advice on specific activities that are happening associated with the oil and gas sector, and that's the environmental impacts of those, including things like emergency response to oil spill. And we have been involved in the production of tools to help on mapping and informed contingency. Examples of this Seabird Oil Sensitivity Index tool. So then the marine protected areas element. Marine protected areas, as you're probably all familiar, I've alluded to them already several times during the course of the presentation, but they are ostensibly management tools, and they're spatial management tools, very much area-based. They tend to be focused on specific features, so habitats and species, and that can often be confusing, because when people see protected areas, they often draw conclusions as to what they're actually for, but primarily they're underpinned by law and very specific bits of law. And there are a whole wide range of commitments that list MPAs as a requirement, from CBD, OSPAR, the IUCN, the 30% by 2030 commitment to which government is committed, UK government at least, And then there are various elements of law, which I won't rehearse again, all familiar with. From a marine species point of view, marine protected areas primarily can be viewed in the marine environment as special protected areas, and those that comes out of the Birds Directive 79, and there's a list of birds in the annex of the directive specifically listed for protection and classification of SPAs. And it's focused on not just breeding, but also feeding, wintering. So from a marine point of view, there are extensions. It's not just colony based. There are also extensions, marine extensions that cover feeding, wintering areas also. Now the implementation, as mentioned, most of the implementation inshore would be the responsibility of the likes of Natural England, SNH, CCW, and Department of the Environment in Northern Ireland. And in JNCC, we deal primarily with offshore, but also working closely on a lot of the inshore classification process. In terms of SPAs, map on the right there, but the network now consists of about 70% of UK's breeding seabirds. So, which is quite, or the sites, I should say, for breeding seabirds, which is quite a significant chunk. And that represents about 25%, or rather the UK represents about 25% of Europe's breeding seabirds. So it's a huge commitment overall in European terms or regional terms to management of seabirds. From the non-seabird side, the Habitats Directive, Special Areas of Conservation, focused more on those species and habitats of particular conservation importance at a regional level, and they're listed within Annex 2 of the Habitats Directive. And the concept there is more on protection of those areas of critical importance to those species. And again, implementation very much similar situation. There aren't quite as many species, marine mobile species listed in the annexes. Certainly for the marine mammals, there are only 4. 3 of which are inshore, and the one harbour porpoise straddles inshore offshore. So work very closely with other agencies in terms of the designation process of SACs for harbour porpoise. But you can see the justification for designation of sites is generally the critical importance of those species to the UK and also regionally, and particularly for things like grey seals, where 40% of the world population, the vast majority of which are based around Scottish seas. For the harbour porpoise SAC designation process, which is the one that we as JNCC were mostly involved with, the data comes from the surveys that I mentioned earlier, the scan surveys, but also using as much, insofar as possible, data provided by third parties. So a lot of independent operators, and it's based on modeling of the densities of distribution for harbour porpoise. The sites themselves had 3 overarching conservation objectives, and all sites, all MPAs will have objectives associated with those sites. But the sorts of things you'd expect to see is that they remain as a viable component, that you minimize and eliminate any significant disturbance, which can be a particularly challenging issue, particularly when you're talking about trying to overlap this with large-scale offshore development, and then to manage the habitats of the very basis for which those animals are aggregating in these areas. So the last thing I really just want to touch on in the conservation strategy. So given that this is about marine species conservation, one of the things that MPAs probably aren't so good at are, well, given that they're static, they're not so good at the mobile element of mobile species. So MPAs in their own right probably aren't sufficient as a management tool, and that if you're to look at distribution of mobile species across an appropriate range for the species, then you're looking at taking a wider scale approach to management. And in the case of conservation strategies, currently working on that's largely a pressure-based approach. So trying to map out what those pressures are overlapping with what we know about the distribution of the species and trying to identify where the risk areas might be. And that's a much more strategic approach to conservation planning, and it's less static than MPA approach, and it also helps identify where gaps in conservation currently exist for marine species. There are two main strategies that are currently in existence at various stages of development that involve most of the UK government and the devolved administrations. The Scottish Seabird Conservation Strategy, which is obviously quite Scottish focused, but the UK Dolphin, Porpoise and Small Whale Conservation Strategy involves the UK government as well as the other devolved. I mentioned it takes a vulnerability assessment process or pressures, and the concept here is identifying the sensitivities and the pressures to which the species are sensitive, understanding something about where they might be exposed to those pressures, and then mapping the vulnerability of those pressures. Now, from a Scottish seabird perspective, it's 22 seabirds that are considered within the confines of the strategy. And ultimately, the outputs look something like this, provide a brief description of what the significance of the species is within Scottish context. It also provides something around the wider geographical context in relation to this biogeographical population. It links through to the conservation status, particularly linked to the various directives, conventions, and then maps out the pressures and provides some indication of what actions may or may not be required for decision makers. Not quite as advanced for the small cetacean conservation strategy, but similar concepts, 9 species that routinely use UK waters, and the same idea of understanding the mapping of the pressures for those species. And that work is still very much live and ongoing. And I think that's probably as much as I want to cover. I think you're probably all sick of acronyms and terms, so I might leave it at that and throw it up to the floor.
Thank you very much for that very in-depth talk. That was great. We had a couple of questions already submitted through the Q&A, and I was just wondering, do you want to roll out with those polls that you and I created, or do you want to kind of jump in with the Q questions? You're muted at the minute. Let's unmute you.
Yep, here we go.
Yep.
Sorry, I'm just pulling out the Q&A. I don't mind. I suppose it would do no harm. We could start with the polls probably, and I can look at some of the questions.
So all our attendees, there's going to be a question that's just about to appear on your screen. You can only select one, so please choose the answer that is most appropriate for you. So the question asks, how do you feel the UK is doing regarding marine conservation? So just going to give you a few seconds, and then when I close it and launch it, all of you, including us, the panelists, will be able to see the answers. So just going to give you a couple more seconds to select an answer. Okay, 3, 2, 1, and let's share the results. So Declan, are you able to see the answers?
Yeah, I guess that shouldn't come as a surprise. It's interesting. Yeah, I guess it's a lot of these issues around marine conservation. It's hard to tell how engaged the wider community are in marine conservation, how much people know is happening. I think there is a huge amount that's taking place now, and it has ramped up massively over the last 15 or 20 years. But it's really interesting to see that generally, and I realize this is just probably a fairly biased poll of people who've come to meeting, but it's interesting to see that there still is a desire to do better regarding conservation in the marine environment. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's move on to our next question. So that's going to appear on your screens just like before. How well do you feel we are joined up in our approach to marine conservation across the UK? Please select the answer that you think is most appropriate. To our people who are watching on YouTube, I'm sorry, this isn't going to come up on your screen, but hopefully you'll be able to judge what the main answers are from our presenters' answers. So just a few more seconds on that poll, and the results will appear in just a moment. Okay, so 3, 2, 1, and let's share those results.
Yeah, it's also very interesting. It's an even split, I would say.
Mm.
So I'm not quite sure what that says, but I think I probably is an element if you're to take the middle space. Could do better, but yeah, very useful to take away.
Okay, and we've just got a couple more questions that we would like to roll out to you. So this one actually contains two parts. The first question, were you aware of the range of data collection initiatives and monitoring programs for mobile and marine species in the UK? And then the one that is just below it is, do you use any of the data that, for instance, Declan mentioned? And just select the answer that's most appropriate. Okay, so let's go with 3, 2, 1. We're just going to end that now.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm glad to see that there's a fair amount of awareness, but I guess we could always do better on that. And the more that people are aware the data is out there, and particularly the more people can use that data, the better. And I think certainly under freedom of use agreements for publicly collected data, I think JNCC are very keen to try and provide access to information where possible. So, okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
And we have our last question now. How familiar are you with marine work that statutory nature conservation bodies do in the UK?
This is really the context behind this is around profile and awareness, because clearly, I could talk around the work that we do, and I'm very familiar with it, and there is a tendency to sometimes think that everybody is aware of those things. So I think it's good to get a handle on the sorts of people, I guess, that are interested in this space, that are coming to these sorts of talks, how familiar they are. So yeah, I mean, on the face of it, I think most people are familiar with what we do, and again, that's probably because of general interest, but that's good to hear. That is very good to hear. We must be doing something right, at least.
And so the answers are up on the screen. So yeah, it's no surprise that the last one wasn't selected. Otherwise,
Yeah.
if someone selected that, it would be very surprising that they had joined this webinar.
Yeah.
Great, thank you all. That was our polling session. So what we're going to do now is just jump straight into those questions that have been submitted. Let's just stop sharing that. And right, we're just going to go. If you have any questions, any of our attendees that are still with us, please pop them in the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen. Alternatively, YouTube people, can you just pop that into the screen that is in the chat that's below the video? Okay, awesome. So first question. This person, it's not necessarily a question, but a brief view on the part of the Water Framework Directive played in the development of ecological, environmental awareness and statutory control would be kind of just a nice brief mention about that.
Yeah. In truth, I haven't done a lot of work with the Water Framework Directive, but from a personal point of view, I think the Water Framework Directive is probably one of those areas of environmental law and regulation that people are most familiar with, because I think it impacts their lives directly. So I would say that it has had a significant impact in how raising environmental awareness, but in terms of how that feeds through into wider marine species, perhaps it helped facilitate that in the long run, but I don't think I could have any more detailed response than that.
Right, thank you. The second question comes from Sally, asking about the idea of natural change versus climate change. Some of the legislation allows us to take account of natural change when looking at potential impacts. Increasingly, though, climate change is altering our environment. Species and habitats are changing, moving, responding. How will a hold the line type approach of maintaining existing sites sit alongside climate change? That's quite a big question.
Yeah, it is a very big question, and it's something that we certainly, I don't think it's just JNCC, it's across government bodies. It's something they're trying to deal with, and we are directly involved with a number of initiatives and trying to do more work around mitigation planning and that type of thing for climate change and marine climate change in particular. It touches on the last point I was mentioning around conservation strategy and marine protected areas for mobile species, the recognition that things change as a result of changes in their environment, and trying to account for those changes. And you also see, you're starting to see in things like fisheries policy and in other areas where climate change is starting to feature. And I'd point the person to the things like the 25-year environment plan, where climate change is specifically is mentioned as an issue. And I guess we're at the point where this is emergent, trying to develop approaches to dealing with the issues associated with climate change above and beyond the routine or the traditional marine conservation issues.
Thank you. We've got a couple more questions left, so anyone else who wants to ask them, please pop them in the Q&A. The next question is from Lucy and asks, if survey monitoring data has to be collected by a developer as a condition of a license or permission arising from a public administrative requirement in accordance with legislation, does that data come into publicly available data sets in line with the collect once, use many times principle of effective data use?
It's a very good question. I think in the data is still technically owned and is often commercially sensitive, because clearly there are some advantages to operators that hold that data in terms of licensing process. So the data doesn't fundamentally belong to the state or even as part of the licensing process. So most operators, I have to say, will provide that information freely for the greater good, but there's no condition for them to provide access to all of the data collected as part of the licensing or the process. But any analytics that are done to inform licensing, a lot of that information would be freely available.
That's great to know. Next question is from Beth, asking, in terms of pressure, why not put MPAs, for example, porpoise, where there is high bycatch rather than areas of high densities with low pressures?
Yeah, I guess the principles, again, under the marine protected areas, the process is largely guided by the law. And in this case, the MPAs for porpoise were selected for sites that were of particular importance, of habitat importance for the species. So the sites are associated with the species rather than the pressure. Now, the management of the pressure may well be that you would look at areas of high bycatch, so management within the site. But it is a question, and it's something that I think we also have to bear in mind, that management of things like porpoise, and indeed most marine mammal species, at least, they would be protected by law, irrespective of whether they're in an MPA or not. So bycatch is an issue for wider fisheries management policy, but they work in coherence with each other, or they should do. But I accept the point, that is a question that comes up in relation to MPAs, but it's largely the process.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Ian. Is it clear how UK marine conservation is being affected by Brexit? Also, flipping this, how will Brexit affect marine conservation in and by Europe?
Do we have another webinar? That's a super question, and I think it's certainly not taking away, but I think it's a very obvious question. Brexit will have a big effect. How that will relate to what we do, I think a lot of what we do sits above EU. So I did refer a lot to a lot of the EU regulations, but the global conventions, things like OSPAR, all of those sit above the EU law, and there are government commitments to continue to meet things like good environmental status and what have you. So I think Brexit will almost certainly have an effect, particularly because there's no longer the European Court of Justice. And I think the Marine Bill down south, there's a lot in there that's looking to deal with some of that transition. But the broad policy commitments are to at least achieve similar levels of environmental conservation or management post-Brexit.
Thank you for a very nice brief answer there. I'm sure you could definitely expand on that question, certainly. The next question, and our last question that's up on our screens, is also from Ian again, asking, is there any effect being put into development of no takes or no development areas for seabeds and or fisheries, and what might be termed restoration or rewilding?
I'm not sure. I can't really address the rewilding point. It's not something that that certainly I deal with. But in terms of the no-take zones, again, this is a very live issue, and it's something, I guess, since the MPA project started, the concept of no-take zone has been in existence. I think certainly down south in Westminster, the Benyon review was recently published only a couple of weeks ago on the potential for highly protected marine areas. So I think in some parts of the UK, there is this move towards trying to designate potentially more heavily protected areas. But in terms of rolling out no-take zones across the entire MPA network, I think that's highly unlikely, because a lot of the principles are around sustainable development and managing the impacts of the activities on the features within the site, rather than just managing a site per se. They're removing all impact.
Okay, thank you. We have reached the end of the questions that have been submitted through the Q&A box, unless anyone has anything that they want to type straight away. I would just like to say thank you very much, Declan, for today's webinar. It was really interesting, and we've had a good Q&A session afterwards. So thank you to all our attendees as well, and those who answered in the polls. That was really useful and helpful, interesting feedback at least. And yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all, and sorry for the cock up at the beginning. Lesson well learned. Okay, all the best. Cheers, Hannah. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Right, just a note to all our attendees who are still with us, we have plenty of other upcoming webinars. If any of these interest you, please use the same registration link that you have seen, that you used to join this very webinar. Alternatively, if you would actually like to be a speaker on the 5th or the 12th of August, please drop us a line. It can be about anything marine. You don't have to necessarily be in universities, as Declan proved today. We are keen for any of our MASTS partners to be speaking in our webinars. So please drop us a line if that interests you, or just check out any of our upcoming talks. So thank you, and hopefully see you next week.